So now we're going back to Calgary. What was that territory like? What was the travel like?
Oh, the travel was, gosh, it was brutal. It was easy in the summertime because Stu would close in the summer and all the guys would go over to Prince Edward Island or go over to Nova Scotia and work over there and work at the Maritimes. I never went, and so I stayed there in the summers, and we only worked 3-4 shows. We kept doing the TV in the summer, and we'd work Lethbridge on a Thursday night, Calgary on Friday, Edmonton on Saturday, then we had the whole week off. But during the winters, when the winter time came and you're in the van and you got all the Harts and you got 2 vans going, they got ball tires on them, it's black ice, they're pulling the ring, they're going 100 miles an hour. We'd have to wait. We would wait and wait and wait for Bret to get there because he was always late. And we're sitting there in the cold, and the heater barely worked, and we're waiting and waiting, and Bret's an hour late, or one of his other brothers will be an hour later. The van wouldn't even be there to pick us up, and we had to go 500 miles up in the Indian territories, and sometimes the match is supposed to start at 7:30. They wouldn't even set the ring up to like 9 or 10 at night, and then we had to turn around and drive back. It was brutal, but by the same token, I knew that someday I would get a break and go somewhere. And my break actually came out of Calgary to go to the old WWF.
While you were in Calgary, did you ever get stretched by Stu down in the dungeon?
No, I never went down there. He did stretch me on his front porch. The first day I got there, I came up from Pensacola, Florida. I had a pair of blue jeans. I had cowboy boots on. I had one sweatshirt because I lived on the beach. I mean, I didn't have winter clothes. I had my high school leather football jacket, and that was it. And we're out on the porch, and it's 30 below zero, and the wind's blowing. He didn't ask me to come in the house. He stood out on the porch, and we talked. And then he started touching me, and you're in pretty good shape there. Because, I'd been lifting weights, and I was 240 pounds, 20-inch arms, 20-inch neck, and I felt like I was in good shape. And he compared me to superstar Billy Graham. He said because my name was Wayne, and I had that Wayne Coleman. He had this big deltoids like pineapples up here on his shoulders. And what I did, and all the time he's talking to me, he's rotating my body, and then pretty soon he's got me like this. He's going, and I put it on the big superstar Billy Graham, and he almost passed out. And he said, you'll have to come over after you let me go. I was like, oh, man, this guy has cracked my neck, my shoulder. He said, you'll have to come over and we'll go downstairs and get a few workouts in if you want to. I said, yeah, maybe so. That'd be a good idea. I never went down there at all. I never even went back to the house at all.
So you never sampled any of his cooking?
No, I never did. I was never inside the house. I did go there to pick up Wayne Hart or to pick up Smith or one of the guys one time. And while I was waiting, I did get out of the car and I looked down in the dungeon. I looked down in there, and there was a big laundry room, I remember, and it was like clothes were piled up, like piles of laundry, and because that was the laundry room, and then right beside it was Stu had a little set of weights, a little weight room, and just a little mat on the floor, and I just remember Bret on the van sometimes. Bret had the cassette tape. He probably still has it, and Stu had this kid down there, and Bret's playing a tape for everyone to listen to, and the kid's going, ah, 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 and Stu's, hey, come on, fight back, be a man, ah, ah, ah. It was like a real torture chamber.
And the Hart family, would you say they got along well?
They loved Stu and they loved their mother. They all loved each other. If you, as an outsider like me or somebody, would try to interfere into their business, then they would all stick together for sure. But I've seen them argue, and I've seen them get into fights with each other in the backstage, and sometimes right in front of the fans in Calgary. I saw Smith and Stu go at it, and I saw Bruce and Bret go at it, and
was that the time that Smith kicked
Smith tried to kick Stu down below, and with I call it a Puerto Rican uppercut, but he tried it with his foot. Stu blocked him, and Stu went to kick Smith, and Smith turned and ran away. And I still have a good rapport with all that family. after all these years, I have a respect for them, what they went through, and they have a respect for me because I not only went there and got over and sold out a lot of places, sold out a lot of buildings along with them, but every time I would leave, I'd turn around and come back 3-6 months later, and I was back there like 3 different times. You know, they must have thought I had to be crazy because some people only would stay 2 weeks, they'd leave. They pulled a lot of ribs on people, and I was fortunate enough to not be part of that ribbing that they did. I'd seen them put cigarettes on top of John Foley's head while John Foley was sleeping. You know, they might shave someone's eyebrow off. I mean, what are you going to do for 8 hours in a van? You can only have so many beers, and pretty soon you got to start ribbing guys.
And you actually started in that territory calling yourself Honky Tonk Wayne.
Well, I sent my bio and everything up to Bruce because Bruce was doing all the writing of the magazines and putting out the programs. And I was Honky Tonk Man down in Pensacola. This is where I started this black hair and a jumpsuit about, I don't know, 4 or 5 months ahead of that.
Do you want to go into that before you tell us about Bruce, maybe?
Well, I don't want to forget Bruce because when I got to Calgary and the first thing they introduced me or I opened the program, it said Honky Tonk Wayne. What? I didn't send you that up here. I sent you Honky Tonk Man. I just thought it might be better if we call you partly by your real name and partly by the gimmick name. Oh, well, thanks a lot, because I didn't want it to be that way.
Did Bruce Hart have anything to do with coming up with the Honky Tonk Man gimmick?
No, absolutely not. I think we went over that earlier with, the wrestling fans in Mobile and Pensacola down in Southeast gave me the jumpsuit. I had the black hair. Robert Fuller gave me the guitar. I gave myself the name off a record, Johnny Horton's I'm a Honky Tonk Man. And that's how that started. Then Bruce, the only thing Bruce did was change the name to Honky Tonk Wayne, which I hated and I didn't want. And so I even had a jacket at home that I wore as a ring jacket that had Honky Tonk Man on it. On the back, it had Honky Tonk Man. On the front, it was embroidered. Honky Tonk Man, like a tour jacket that the country and western people had back then. And I had to cover up the name on the front, and I couldn't wear it on their TV because it said Honky Tonk Man on the back, but he was calling me Honky Tonk Wayne. My wife remembers me as that because that's how she met me, as that character. And, Shultz would always say, just let it go. Don't worry about it. Dr. D. David Shultz. I said, well, that's not how I've created this character. It's not that way. But Bruce had nothing to do with the creation of this character. He had nothing to do with the guitar. I brought it with me. I used it up there. Stu was the one who said, sure, I like it. Let's do it. And, I really answered to Stu the whole time I was there and no one else.
Now, I recently read Bruce Hart's book, and it seems like there's a lot of tension between Bruce and Bret in the book over the years.
Oh, gosh, yes.
Including back when you wrestled for them.
Oh, yes.
Did you ever notice any tension between Bruce and Bret?
I saw them have their words. I saw them periodically. They might push each other. I mean, they never actually punched each other or anything that I know of. They always had Sunday dinner. I can imagine being a fly on the wall at that big Sunday dinner with all the whole family there every Sunday to listen to what was going on. But Bruce was the booker, but yet he didn't give finishes so much to me and to David Shultz or to Bret. Bret did his own thing, and Bret was always, unless someone else like a David Shultz or Dan Crawford that was a big star there, they were always, the guys that Stu was pushing, the outsiders, were always the North American Heavyweight Champion, unless Bret had the belt at some time or another. And then the world's champion was coming in, whether it be Harley Race or whether it be Nick Bockwinkel. Then Bret would always wrestle the world's champion. So Bruce never liked that because Bruce was booking and he thought he should be the one that was wrestling the world's champion, or he thought he should be one calling the finishes. But by the same token, he didn't call the finishes for certain guys. And that made his job difficult. I understand that when you're having to split your power. And I just know that Bret always wanted to wrestle the world's champion. He got to wrestle the world's champion except the one time that I know of. And it was just before Bret and Dynamite and Davey and Jim Neidhart went to WWF. Nick Bockwinkel came to town, and Dr. D. David Shultz made a power play on Stu and said, I'm the North American heavyweight. I don't care who the North American heavyweight. I think Bret was at the time maybe. Because Shultz was in a tag team match with me. I don't care who the North American champion is. It might have been Leo Burke at that time. He said, I want to wrestle Nick Bockwinkel, and that's just how it is. I've been up here for all these years, and I've done this for you, and I've done this, I've done that, and I've had to listen to this and listen to that, and all this stuff you guys do around here. Either I wrestle Nick Bockwinkel or I'm walking. So Nick came to town, and David wrestled Nick Bockwinkel, but I later found out that it might have been a way for David to wrestle Nick Bockwinkel because David wanted to go to AWA because Hogan was down there and they were doing great business. Payoffs were good. It wasn't that far of a trip out of Calgary to get down to Minneapolis. And he eventually, a couple of months later, he ended up at the AWA.
Did you ever hear that David Shultz has claimed that he actually came up with the idea for the first WrestleMania?
I was there, but I was in the car when he would talk about it. We would drive 300, 400, 800 miles, and he had this idea about WrestleMania. And he had this idea about having these stars come in.
Because I heard he would say over and over Dr. D and Mr. T, and he wanted it to be Dr. D and Mr. T.
And then something happened where they used Paul Orndorff and Piper, Mr. T and Hogan, and he got cut out of the loop. And I don't know the inside story on why he was cut out of the loop on that first WrestleMania.
I believe it had something to do with the John Stossel incident.
I think it probably did. It could have. You'd have to, that would be an interesting story to sit down with Dr. D. David Shultz and get his insight. Let me go back just for a second and say that I had a dispute with Stu, myself and David Shultz. So we called up Al Tomko. Al Tomko was promoting his All-Star Wrestling out of Vancouver, and they were the same as Turner Broadcasting, TBS in Atlanta. The station in Vancouver was the first satellite TV station in Canada that they beamed the signal all across Canada. And so for us to be on that BC TV was a major, major deal, especially if you wanted to be known across Canada, because Stu's TV only went in Alberta and Saskatchewan. It didn't go into BC or anything like that.
And Alberta and Saskatchewan are fairly scarcely populated provinces for anyone who doesn't know Canada.
So Stu and, of course, Bruce and a couple of the brothers, they disliked Al Tomko to no end, and why, I do not know. Because Al never really came to Calgary. He never tried to steal talent from them. I mean, Jerry Morrow would go over there and work for Al Tomko. He would come back, and Jerry would work for Stu. And a lot of guys would go back and forth sometimes. But when David and I decided that we were a hot program in Calgary, we'll take this program and go over for Al Tomko. He offered us twice as much money, so we said, sure, we'll go. So we went over and did that for Al. And going over for Al, I was able to then establish Honky Tonk Man. Not Honky Tonk Wayne anymore. Al, I want to be called Honky Tonk Man. Well, then Shultz leaves, goes back to Stu, goes to Minneapolis. I stay with Al. And for the next 6 or 8 months or a year, I was all across Canada on Canadian TV. I went back for Stu. We buried the hatchet. Everything was good. And then WWE came through. I met Hogan and those guys again that I haven't seen in 10, 12 years, like I said earlier. And then when I met up with him in Calgary, he said, man, why don't you come join us? How come you never come to Minnesota? And all this stuff. And then he said,
Hogan was working for WWE?
Yes. They had a big show at the Calgary Stampede, and Stu was able to get me on the card. It was sold out. It was 22,000 people at the Saddle Dome. And that was my in with Hogan. He took me in the bathroom, and he said, how come you ain't joined up with us yet? I said, well, I didn't know. I mean, I didn't think I was good enough. And he says, man, you're as good as anybody else. He said, I'll have Vince call you tomorrow. Next morning, 8 o'clock, phone rang, and that was it. I told him, I said, I need to tell Stu and give a notice. He said, that's the right thing to do. He called Stu himself. He said, I want to start using this guy.